Welcome to Bat Lessons, the Batman History Podcast. I'm Alex.
And I'm Brian.
And this time we're talking about the crime comics that made parents lose their mind in the 1950s and what it meant for Batman. Are you excited about it, Brian?
Yes, I am excited. We have been kind of hinting at this topic for quite some time. And then outside of the pod or the video or vlog, whatever we're doing here, we've talked about it a bunch of times as well, because it's a really fascinating time in history. Can't wait 100%. To talk about it.
Yeah, there's actually like some lost media where we actually did like a pilot. It was like a technical recording session before episode 1. I don't know if you remember us doing this.
I do not remember this in the slightest.
So it's like I had just signed up for Riverside, which was the technology we were using at the time. And we were on a phone call for like 30 minutes just to make sure that like everything was working. We talked about the Comics Code Authority a little bit on that call. You were excited to talk about it. So that's like 2.5 years in the making, a little bit more.
Oh, man. Slow burn.
Yeah. What do you know about the Comics Code, the moral panic of the 1950s around comics?
What do I know? So I would say I know a fair amount about what the code was, and that it like really precipitated this shift from like the like gritty crime centric like golden age of like say Batman comics to like the really goofy like just like silly inane like Silver Age stuff. And that's where we had this shift from like the Joker that like killed people to like the Joker that just like foiled Batman for the sake of foiling Batman.
Sure, yeah. I think that's about right. I think there are some ways that like the popular conception of it is a little bit different, but like 10,000 foot view before we get into like the nitty gritty history is that like it used to be the case that every single comic book had to be approved by a board of like librarians and like educators and like, you know, basically to say that it was, you know, fit for consumption, and they put a little seal on the front.
Yeah. Bureaucracy.
And kind of, yeah. And that's no longer the case today. But it shaped comics for a long time.
Yeah.
And
a long time. I did not realize how long until I was looking some of the stuff up yesterday.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't have notes and like history prepared on anything after like the inception. But I do know that, like, it was still in place as late as, like, 2011. Not everyone was participating, but, like, Archie was still submitting to the Comics Code.
So crazy.
We are going to talk about what's in the Comic Code, either today or on a supplemental episode. But it's worth noting that at that time in 2011, it was different. Like, the Comics Code changed a few times.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, like, only twice. Like, once in the 70s and then once in the 80s, I think. But point being, like... It wasn't frozen in amber. So yeah, the anti-comics movement. So let's put ourselves into the 1950s a little bit. Let's try to like get into that moment.
Oh boy.
You got to understand that how popular comic books were in the 1950s. If you remember Famous Funnies, that first pamphlet comic book that we talked about episodes ago, that was 1933. It's the first comic book that we think of, 1933. At that point, hardly anyone's reading comic books. But by 1950, there's over 600 different comic book titles hitting the newsstand every month, right? So you have 600 different books to choose from. And there are 100 million comic books selling in the United States every month.
That's a lot. Every month. 100
every
million.
Month.
Wow.
It's hard to know exactly who was reading comic books, like how many adults, how many children, like what the breakdown of those 100 million are. But we do have some information. There were surveys of children from the time that said that 95% of boys and 91% of girls were reading comic books. And the reason for that is that they were highly available. They were cheap. A comic book was just 10 cents. But other children's books would sell for like $1 or $2. So just a fraction. And comics were notoriously passed around. Like, think if you're a millennial and you know that like Yu-Gi-Oh cards or like Pokemon cards were getting traded at like recess, think that, but comic books or Pogs if you're a little bit before that. I'm sure there's other analogs. Yeah. Every single comic book, some people estimated, would be read between 5 and 8 additional readers beyond the first.
Oh man, because of that, I bet there's some very sad adults that were like, as a kid, I had Action Comics, but I just traded it on the schoolyard because like that's what we did.
Sure, yeah. I mean, in the 1950s, we're like past World War II, so like a lot of those like really super early stuff was like destroyed as part of the war effort. But like, totally,
it's like right after.
Yes.
World War II.
Yeah. The way that they engaged with it was totally different. And one scholar that I've been referencing a ton is Dr. Carol Tilley. We'll talk about more about her work in a bit. She's at the School of Information Sciences at University of Illinois, she points out something that's really interesting to me. There are more kids in 1950 reading comic books than play video games today, like as a percentage.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, you're saying 91% of girls and 95% of boys. That's that's crazy. Those are crazy bananas numbers.
It cuts across race. It cuts across gender. It cuts across class in a way that very few things do today, right? Yeah. And like, I think it's easy to think that like because of the internet, we've all atomized. Like it's easier to niche down now than it used to be back then, and that's true. But even so, like it's just like everybody was reading comics. It was
everybody.
Yes, it was crazy pervasive. Parallel with this, there are lots of groups that take issues with comics. Librarians and teachers.
Yeah.
Actually really hated comic books. It was felt at the time that language and vernacular of characters in comic books was poor, right? And that you would talk the way that characters would talk and you would learn bad English because of it. As we're saying for all of these, like most of this is not true. Like there's a lot of like really great scholarship done and academics done that have gone back and like looked at it and like turns out actually they spoke pretty good English on the whole. And so that wasn't really a concern, but it was felt that kids would spend their time reading comic books instead of more enriching books, right? So the idea is like we have the classics. We have things that are going to like stimulate the mind, and comic books aren't that. They're going to instill poor values. They're going to teach bad English. Again, there's some scholarship that was happening actually at the time about this, and not really true. Like kids who read comic books also read other books and vice versa. It was felt that kids would look at just the images and not read words at all, right? And that it was a crutch, and that like the pictures were more prevalent than the words. And like, I don't know, Brian, when you read Golden Age comic books, do you think that they are wordy or not wordy?
I mean, pretty wordy.
Crazy
wordy.
They
do a lot of like saying instead of showing.
There's 2 to 3 times as many words in a Golden Age comic book per page than there is in a modern comic book today, right? Like there's a lot of text to the point where like it's crowding out art sometimes, right?
Yeah. But I mean, there's also, I'm sitting back here with a smirk because it's like, very sarcastically, I'm thinking like, oh, I'm glad that this ended with the Comics Code Authority. Like, it's not like old people have always hated what young people like, and that content is bad and needs to be censored.
Yes, 100%. We'll talk more about like how some of these things are replaced, like almost immediately. People move on from comic books to like demonizing the next media or whatever. Yeah. But beyond librarians and teachers, there's various parents and mothers groups that take issue with comics. The content was felt to be over-sexualized, violent, morally questionable. They would display crime, drug and alcohol use, even things like bad manners, right? Disrespect for authority, rowdiness, right? This idea of juvenile delinquency, which we'll talk more about here in a minute.
Yeah, totally. On those same lines, like that's the thing we see in like say YouTube today is you watch videos on like how to pick locks, and it's like, oh, you're teaching people how to break the law. Like this is a how-to on crime. Yeah, no,
I definitely think that like when people talk about like TikTok brain rot, I do think there's some merit to that. The idea that like we're hyping people up on dopamine, that like people's attention spans are shorter and shorter than ever. However, like, you know, kids saying skibbity toilet, like, I don't know, that's just slang, right? It's normal for the older generation to not get what the younger kids are doing, right? Like we had our own stuff when I was a kid as well.
Yep, I remember. It's a fun time.
Yeah. And public concern for contents of comics is roiling, you know, throughout the time of the comic book's existence. It's not just, you know, in 1950. That's kind of when it's coming to a head, right? It even predates comic books themselves, like when comic strips are a thing. And it's not a surprise because there's all kinds of parallel social movements that are happening at the same time. Temperance and prohibition are happening around then, which is like making alcohol illegal. The moral panic around the content of movies, which resulted in the motion picture production code, or the Hays Code. That shows up in the 1930s. Yep. There's the Code of Practices for Television, which is sort of similar, right? Shows up in 1952. So that's just before Comics Code Authority. The Red Scare is going on. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Red Scare.
Well, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So the gist of that is that, like, there's this thing called McCarthyism. There's the senator called Joseph McCarthy. He's leading this movement to excise all communists, quote unquote communists, from public life and government involvement, sort of trying to ideologically align the entire nation against an idea. It's, you know, fascist stuff.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean,
nothing in common with today.
just won a war, and they were like, "Look, we learned about all these other governments, and they're bad. So we need to protect democracy. So just everything about those other governments is bad, and if you like those, you're bad too."
Right.
Right. So it's this like kind of leads into some of the thought police stuff and like the 1984 and the book, not the year.
Yes. And the attitudes on censorship back then were just different, right?
Oh yeah.
Orwell doesn't write 1984 until 1949, right? Bradbury doesn't
pegged that.
Yeah.
That was off the dome. So
it's good, right? It's part of this milieu, right? Like Bradbury doesn't write Fahrenheit 451 until 1953.
Yeah.
And while I would actually argue those books aren't super about censorship the way that we think about it today, right? Like Orwell's writing about fascism. Bradbury's writing about TV, right? He's not actually, writing about censorship the way we think about it, right? It's certainly the case that the books form our thoughts that come out of that moment. So yeah, where we have this sort of like modern American theory that some people are really into, that's free speech is a principle, right? That's applied to like all contexts rather than being about the government preventing dissent. The thinking back then was different. Although I will say that things like the RIAA, the Recording Industry of America, marking record labels as explicit with the parental advisory sticker or whatever, that doesn't happen until the 90s.
Right.
The ESRB rating games doesn't happen until the 90s.
No, yeah.
MPAA, the Motion Picture Association, moving away from the Hays Code to a rating system happens in the 60s, right? So like we continue to have like censorship type things even today, right? So like in some ways the attitudes have shifted, in other ways they haven't.
I mean, I think that there is like an angle on regulation here that makes a lot of sense to me, to say like just abstract away from content and censorship, but like how do you know that the food you're buying is safe?
Totally.
Right. And that's like where the FDA comes in, and they set a bunch of rules, because it used to be that they like took advantage of how consumers didn't have chemistry sets. They couldn't test the quality of their flour. Right. And stuff like that. And so like, I think that being able to say like, there is not a reasonable expectation that everyone knows everything, and being able to mark them as safe or as safe for a certain age or whatever, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially like as a parent, being able to say like, oh, this video game is okay for my kids, or this video game's a little too intense and stuff like that.
100%.
But that's not censorship, right? That's just labeling and ratings and stuff like that. But I know that there's like kind of a fuzzy line on some of those things too.
Well, I think the idea, right, that like I would not let my child watch a movie with like sufficient violence or gore or sex or language or whatever actually is censorship, right? But it's a decision that I'm making. It's not one that the government is making.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
And so I think the attitude now tends to be, and I think I tend to align myself with this, right? That it's about giving people the tools to be able to do that, right? Rather than saying that people aren't allowed to sell something, right? Or that something shouldn't be allowed to exist, like that there's a wrong think, to borrow from Orwell, right? So anyway, all these parallel movements that are happening, McCarthyism, the movies, TVs, temperance, right? These parallel movements take up a lot of the oxygen, right? And they defer action on comics, right? So even as people are talking, in the 30s and 40s about it, those things are more important. Also World War II, right? Like people's focus is on that. There's just limited attention in the public eye about comic books. But eventually that public sort of outcry comes to a head in 1954, right? And that happens when there's a new Senate subcommittee on juvenile delinquency. That subcommittee is really another example of a much smaller moral panic, right? That's happening at the same time. Like every era, there were some social ills that were affecting youth. Like there was gangs, heroin was starting to be kind of an epidemic at the time. There was these improvised guns that became popular called zip guns, where basically you would make it yourself, right? Like people talk now about 3D printed guns, but like happening in the 50s too, right? But the reality is that like crime rates and like drug usage, et cetera, were actually pretty low. Like in the context of what became before and what came after, like stuff was time was pretty good. They're largely worried about stuff that isn't happening or is really happening, but they're worried about other stuff that they're not actually talking about, right?
Yeah.
This is the time when the nuclear family becomes dominantly popular. Multi-generational households stop being a thing, right? So you're just living with you and your children, or you and your parents, as opposed to having like your cousins and your aunts and your uncles, your grandparents, right? All living under one roof. Suburbia is super popping off.
Yeah.
Right. So we get the sort of stereotypical housing where, white picket fence, single family homes set back from each other, tract housing, right?
Yeah. Well, like the cookie cutter is like, just to explain the metaphor a little bit, is they all look the same. It's like, like I imagine, and this might be kind of a dumb comparison, but like I imagine Edward Scissorhands.
Sure.
And when you go through, and it's like every house is the same, but they're just painted different colors.
I live in a neighborhood like that, by the way. Like, it's super part of the American experience now. Yeah,
totally. And usually that's accompanied with by like HOAs and stuff. But at that time, I don't think that was.
I don't think back then. Yeah, that's a newer invention. The Los Angeles metro from 1930 to 1950 doubles in population, right? So like, and that's just urban sprawl, right? And suburban sprawl.
Wow.
Yes. In that same period of time, the population density of Manhattan is falling. So you get this sort of like de-densification that's happening even in urban centers, right? So people are becoming a little bit less socially connected, right? In a weird way.
Okay.
Parallel with that, after World War II, the US GDP like goes crazy, like ape mode, like off the chain, out of control. We're enjoying our status as the world hegemonic power, right? Like everyone switches to the dollar for trade.
Yep.
Disposable income is through the roof. And so kids who previously might have been working or, were very poor, all of a sudden they've got money and they've got time, right? And so you get some interesting social movements like rock and roll. You get these social clubs that are mistaken for gangs, right? So you get people who are really into like hot riding cars, or you get people who are really into stupid stuff like, cross stitching and knitting, and you get people who are into, paper airplanes, and like they form like social groups, right?
Yeah.
And the parents don't get it, right? Like they're acting strange. They're running around in these big groups. There's the shift to like consumerism and capitalism, right? That they've lived through the Great Depression.
Yeah.
The kids have not, right? So they're living in abundance where the parents have lived in scarcity. And there's just this impedance mismatch. It's just a social shift that's freaking the older generation out, right? And so they label all of this as juvenile delinquency. And they're having hearings about it. Like, how do we fix it? Like, how do we get the kids to like be part of society and good upstanding, stop talking the slang. And they're having all kinds of hearings. And they're some of the first to be televised.
Okay.
So television is starting to show up in a big way in the 50s. People are buying televisions. They're watching these hearings. One of the hearings they have in the subcommittee on juvenile delinquency is on comic books. And the center of that hearing is a guy named Fredric Wertham. Have you heard of Fredric Wertham?
Not a single time.
Okay. So massive caveat, okay? Fredric Wertham is very obviously a guy trying to do the right thing. Right? The dude worked as a child psychologist for pretty much his whole life, largely serving underprivileged kids in New York City. Yeah. So not for free, but basically for free. Like kids and families could come and get therapy for like 5 cents, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That's great. Even for the cost at that time. Because like a comic book was 10 cents, right?
Yeah. So it's basically nothing, right?
Yeah.
He ran a clinic called the La Ferru. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's French. Clinic with a bunch of other child psychologists, right? And he's trying to help them. And he was working with all genders and all races, right? At a time when that was not common. His takes in his book, Seduction of the Innocent, which you might have heard of, about racism and sexism are like pretty on point. Like, there's plenty of stuff that's outdated. Don't get me wrong. But like, he's got good attitudes, right? About like, can we get along and like treat each other like humans? And like, what is this teach? Like when he's getting mad about comic books, he's also getting mad about like, what is it teaching us about gender? What is it teaching us about, race, right?
I mean, all fair points. Because as we've read The Golden Age, there's been a lot of times where we're like, oh my God, I can't believe this was okay. Yeah.
And not in a way. And I know like race and gender like today are like hot button issues in like dumb ways. This is in ways that would have been like totally obvious to everyone.
Well, that's good.
Yes, it is good.
I mean, because I was kind of starting to wonder, he's a psychologist, child psychologist in like the 40s and 50s.
Yes.
What was the psychology that he was
not
teaching?
Great.
That's
not great.
It's all based on Freud, or is there like more modern?
A lot of Freud stuff.
Yeah, so that's part of where my head's at too. Is like,
don't get me wrong. I'm almost done with the section of caveating.
Okay.
But he's not. He wrote on a lot of other topics besides comic books. In fact, some of his books were cited in Brown v. Board of Education, which integrated schools across races. So did a lot of really good and important work. And he was trying to do the right thing. I think probably trying to be a good guy, right?
Sure.
But because he's the figurehead of this movement, he's the punching bag.
Sure.
In most people's eyes, Wertham is the reason that comic books were censored. Everyone hates him. Even modern scholars, like people who are writing books, are really hesitant to talk about him in a negative light because they think that people who are uneducated, right, like people like us, like fans coming in, are going to like misunderstand him. And he's a complicated guy, and it is easy to misunderstand. So that's all the caveating out of the way. We're going to hit on the rest of the episode. That's just the reality. Yeah. He wrote this book called Seduction of the Innocent. I have a copy here. These are online. Don't buy these. Okay. These ones with the gold foil and the hardbacks that are really nice, the new printings. His family is basically engineered artificial scarcity of the original book. Like they buy up copies and take them off the market. And then they do these fancy printings with gold foil and charge like hundreds of dollars for them. Don't buy this book. Pirate it. It's very easy to find online. There's no reason to pay people. This guy's dead, long dead. The book is not. Yeah.
So what's your hot take on the Disney Vault then?
My hot take on the Disney Vault was I tend to abhor artificial scarcity. Like the idea that like you shouldn't pirate a video game and we're not going to sell it to you is pretty dumb. So yeah, go find a copy of this book free online if you want to read it. Which by the way, I don't recommend. I've read like, I don't know, 2/3 of it, half to 2/3 of it. His take is that comics are bad, right? So, and he starts from that premise, right? Comics are obviously ruining kids' brains, right? He doesn't even really try to convince you at first, right? The analogy he uses is that of a gardener. When you're a gardener and the plant like withers and dies, you don't blame the plants, right? You blame the gardener, right? So his idea is that like we're responsible for the kids and like we have to take care of them. We have to water them. We have to make sure they get sunlight, right? And like there are ways in which that argument I'm sympathetic to, like the idea that like you are what you eat, right? Like you will become what you're taking in, and therefore like you should care as a parent about what your kid is taking in, right? I'm sympathetic to that, but the way he says it is really really interesting. So here's one of the passages from the first like 20 pages of the book. Some time ago, a judge found himself confronted with 12 youths, the catch of some 150 policemen assigned to prevent a street battle of juvenile gangs. This outbreak was a sequel to the killing of a 15-year-old boy who had been stabbed to death as he sat with his girl in a parked car. The 12 boys were charged with being involved in the shooting of 3 boys with a 22 caliber zip gun and a 32 caliber revolver. The indignant judge addressed them angrily. "We're not treating you like kids any longer. If you act like hoodlums, you'll be treated like hoodlums." But were these youths treated like kids in the first place? Were they protected against the corrupting influence of comic books, which glamorize and advertise dangerous knives and guns that can be converted into deadly weapons? That's one of the first times he says the words comic books in the whole book, right?
Wow.
It's matter of fact. He says, were they protected from the corrupting influence of comic books? In the first time he tells you about comic books, like he's not trying to convince you. He's just telling you they're bad, right? That's his take. Throughout the book, he kind of jumps around, right? Like he sort of flits from example to example to example. It's not really organized per se. I mean, there are chapters that are about different things, but like he will indulge himself in like telling a story that like is to talk about how comics are bad or like paint them all with the same brush, right? And he has lots of like sort of tropes that drive me crazy. So like one of the things that he does really frequently is he'll conflate depiction with instruction. Right. This kind of overlaps with what you were talking about, like teaching kids how to pick locks. That was the thing you were saying earlier, right? Yeah. He will say that because something happens in a book, right, that they're teaching the kid how to do it. So here's a quote from a passage. "So we carefully followed developments. In a crime comic that came out after the code had been in existence for some time, a representative specimen of this group shows killing a policeman knocked out with a usual smart, contemptuous wisecrack. I can't stick around to explain, copper. A man shot in the stomach. A woman mugged and then killed with a hammer to get her pocketbook. Blood. The up-to-date ending of one murder story. Archie Frizz didn't die in the electric chair. The state psychiatrist found him to be insane. Detailed instructions about how to hold up a big grocery store and brutal murder story with the murderer not even caught by law, but dying in an accident, right? So, yes. So he says, like, detailed instruction on how to hold up a big grocery store. I can tell you with a certifiable fact, there was no 1950s comic book that told you how to rob a grocery store, right?
Yeah.
He does this thing where, because they show it, it's teaching you how to do it. To study the psychological effects of comics in children, one must have more than a superficial and scantily knowledge of what is in them. For in the children's nightmares, or in their play, or in their productions and psychological tests, any association or reference occurs to Venusians or Voltamen, to a synthoshade, or to the precise instructions on how to case wealthy homes. For burglaries, you will not understand their response if you do not know the stimulus. So that's kind of a complicated way of saying, right? Like, okay, Venusians, which are like imaginary people from Venus, or Voltamen, yeah, which are like imaginary, cyborgs, right? Or synthoshades, right? Like these things that you don't understand, right? Like if you're a parent, you have no clue what that is. How could you possibly understand how it's influencing their play, right? And he lumps those things in with precise instructions on how to case wealthy homes.
So interesting. It's really bizarre too. Cause like specifically the how to case wealthy homes. Like I remember in, I don't know, late 90s, early thousands, there was like a show maybe on the Discovery Channel or something like that. And it was about these two guys who were like successful, but like reformed, like burglars. That like talked in detail about how to break into houses and like how quickly it works and like which houses are at risk because of where they're located on the street and like what the view is from the road and all this stuff. And it was all in this idea of like teaching you how to secure your house against this kind of stuff. But like mostly it was just like really fascinating to see how like criminals worked.
Sure.
And that is instruction, I guess.
Sure. Well, and the thing is that like, it's not even that, right? Like, so you're right. There's the lock-picking lawyer on YouTube today. Yeah. And you could argue that he's showing you how to pick a lock, right? He is instructing you how to do it. This is not that, right? Like, if you've ever read a Golden Age comic book, you understand that this is 8 pages, right? Where well, in a minute here, we're going to talk about a comic book that I made you read. Would you say that anything you saw in that was instruction on how to commit a crime?
No.
Right.
It's like there is a really vast, because to me, it sounds like this guy has like very little imagination and is willing to like make some big logical leaps to be able to say like, okay, I read this thing about how evil a person could be, and therefore I can be in the mind of a very evil person. And it's like like the comic you had me read was about H.H. Holmes, the like first American serial killer. Yes. And like it just kind of described in some very broad strokes how he set up his system. But it, like there was no schematic, there was no like description of like how he went from here to there, or like how he like it's just that there have to be some like really big logical leaps to say like, therefore I could do it based on this like really low quality instruction. Right, if we're calling it instruction, right?
Yes.
So like it's just really wild.
Yes. Well, it's like saying I saw the opening scene in The Dark Knight where the Joker holds up a bank, and therefore I know how to hold up a bank. Like that was a recipe on how to hold up a bank. It is nothing of the sort, right? Like it is showing something happening. It's not the same as telling you how to do it.
Yeah, it's like this looks easy, therefore it is easy.
Right.
Which is not ever the case.
he has other tropes, right? Beyond the conflation with depiction and instruction. He paints with a broad brush. So one of the things that he hammers on over and over and over and over is the idea of quote unquote crime comics, right? And I think this is designed as a deflection of one of the sort of like primary problems that people have with him, which is that like, actually, there are some comic books that were doing some pretty crazy stuff in the 1950s. They were violent. They were bloody. They were a lot, right? And little kids probably shouldn't be reading them. And so, people would come to him and say like, what about like Mickey Mouse? What about Donald Duck? Because those were hugely popular at the time. What about, animal comics apparently were a thing. There's jungle comics were really popular. Western comics were really popular, right? And he says his sort of answer to them is that like, those are crime comics too. Yes. So, quote, for example, a 10-year-old girl from a cultivated and literate home asked me why I thought it was harmful to read Wonder Woman, a crime comic, which we have found to be one of the most harmful. She saw in her home many good books, and I look at that as the starting point, explaining to her what good stories and novels were. I told her, suppose you get used to eating sandwiches made with very strong seasonings, with onions and peppers and highly spiced mustard. You will lose your taste for simple bread and butter and for finer food. The same is true of reading strong comic books. If later on you want to read a good novel, it may describe how a young boy and girl sit together and watch the rain falling. They talk about themselves, and the pages of the book describe what their innermost thoughts are. That is what it is called literature. You will never be able to appreciate that if, in comic book fashion, you expect that any minute someone will appear and pitch both of them out the window. In this case, the girl understood and the advice worked, right? So there's numerous examples of that where he says like, well, Batman and Robin, they're stopping people who do crimes, so it is a crime comic book, right?
Yeah.
In Wonder Woman, there are people who do crime, so it is a crime comic book. In, an issue of like Donald Duck I picked up, like there was someone who, jaywalked.
Yeah.
And so it's a crime comic. And in the Jungle Books, there was violence. And so it's a crime comic book, right? So like he does this like equivalence thing where he spends all of his time talking about how crime comic books are bad. But if you ask about anything else, those are also crime comic books.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like I'm listening to this description. I'm thinking like, what did he think about nursery rhymes?
Right. Well, that's actually something that comes up a lot, right? As parents and teachers and librarians, right, are pushing on all these ways that comic books aren't as good as classics, there are groups of people who try to make comic books sort of higher brow, right? So there were Bible adaptations, right, that were put into comics. There were adaptations of the classics that were put into comic adaptations, right?
Well, those are definitely crime comics.
Well, that's basically what he says, right? He's like, well, if you have something like, A Tale of Two Cities, there's a lot of violence in that. And when you distill it down to a comic book, that's all that's left, right? Like you don't get the nuance anymore, right? If you're in Hamlet, they kill people, right? And so, if you're reading a comic of Hamlet and you just look at the pictures, it's the same as a crime comic book, right? And he's like, you're taking all of the stuff that was good about the classic and you're removing it. It's his sort of argument, right? Those are crime comic books too.
Wow.
Yeah. Another thing that he does is he will gerrymander newspaper comic books or newspaper comics out of the sort of stack of bad things and comic books in, right? Right? Because he knows parents read comic strips. Like everyone gets the newspaper. Like the president, we talked about it, is reading Dick Tracy. Everyone's super into newspaper strips, right?
Yeah.
Quote, our study concerned itself with comic books and not with newspaper comic strips. There are fundamental differences between the two, which the comic book industry does its best to cloud. Comic strips appear mainly in newspapers and Sunday supplements of newspapers. Comic books are separate entities, always with colored pictures and a glaring cover. They are called books by children, pamphlets by the printing industry, magazines by the post office, which accords them second-class mailing privileges. Comic books are most widely read by children, comic strips by adults. There is, of course, an overlap, but the distinction is a valid and important one. Newspaper comic strips function under a severe censorship exercised by some 1,500 newspaper editors of the country who sometimes reject details or even whole sequences of comic strips. For comic books, there exists no such censorship by an outside agency which has the authority to reject. When comic strips are reprinted as comic books, the censorship that existed before, where they were intended for adults, disappears, and the publisher enjoys complete license. He can, and sometimes does, add a semi-pornographic story for the children. For example, and a gory cover, things from which censorship protects the adult comic strip reader.
That was a roller coaster.
Yeah.
Especially at the end there.
they add the semi-pornographic story for the children. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like hot, like big, bold claims, right?
Yeah.
He often makes sort of like strident, bold statements without like examples to back it up. Another thing that he does, right, is he quotes children a lot, right? So he does have tons and tons and tons of experience.
This is dangerous, actually.
Yeah. Working directly with children as a child psychologist. Mm-hmm. And he there's huge swaths of the book where he's talking about what they said about comic books, right? Supposedly. And all of it reads like, r/that happened, right? Like it's all like my cousin works for Nintendo. I've got a girlfriend in Canada. It's all like very, very dubious. And I took a couple examples that I wanted to share with you. When asked a 10-year-old child who reads 10 comic books a week, what are your thoughts about comics? I like murder comics. Another 12-year-old child. I like gangbusters. Crime does not pay. Batman and Superman. They do murders, like shooting. The girls do things to the men. Catch bad men and take them to the law. Bullets bounce off girls and Supergirl. She can fly and swing on ropes. In murder books, men steal and throw the cop off the roof and kill about 5 men. Some make you scared at night. You dream about it and think somebody's going to kill you. Some tells about stealing, killing people. Some stick with knives, shoot with guns, beat them over their heads with sticks and stick them in the eyes. Hit them over the head with a poker and string them up with ropes. I can read them now because I know what's right and wrong. My aunt teaches me not to do bad things.
These are crazy.
I like Superman. A man be laying down in bed and the door be locked and the lady run outside for help and hollers. The man comes from the window. Girls are always getting hurt in comic books. Every time the girl goes with a man, there's a murder and the girl screams. And these are the complete quotes. Like, you can imagine you're asking like a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, an 8-year-old, what do you think about comics, right? Do you think they're saying like 3 sentences?
No.
Do you think they're saying more?
Oh, I'm certain they're saying more.
And do you lead with, I like murder comics?
No. That was a complete quote. Like
yes,
that was
that is one of the quotes
itself.
He provided.
It's just
I like murder comics. Yes.
Yeah, these are. I want to know how old these kids are too, because
they range. They range from like 6 to like 14 to 16. Yeah.
Yeah, some of those read as like very young.
Right. So I can tell you that just from my instinct, a lot of these things strained credulity. When I'm reading it, I'm like, did they say that? Is that all they said? Is this?
Well, it also strikes me as like cherry picking.
Yes, 100%. Yes, that's how I felt about it too.
Okay, because like I remember going to like, say, church camp.
Yes.
100 kids. I'd say like 98 of them were just, they were great. And I remember like 1 or 2 kids that I thought like, your parents are letting you watch whatever you feel like and you're saying things you're not supposed to say. And that's like, that's a reflection on the parent, in my opinion, not the
100%.
television or whatever.
Yes. And the fact of the matter is that he is working with underprivileged kids, right? These are people who are experiencing violence. These are kids who are experiencing extreme poverty, abuse, right? Are involved in messed up situations that kids should not be in. I don't think there's anyone who contests that, right?
Yeah.
That being said, even so, a lot of these strain my ability to believe are word for word quotes. We'll come back to that.
Okay.
Finally, before we move on, what's in the book? What do you think he says about Batman? What do you know about the moral panic in Batman?
Well, Batman's a vigilante. He is a criminal, right? Like it is of all the crime comics, it's the crimiest crime comic.
Yeah. Wertham's not worried about that. Or at least that's not what he talks about when he talks about Batman.
Okay. I mean, the other thought I have is that most of his villains are like insane. They're not just like regular criminals.
He's not worried about that either.
What?
Feel free to interject. I'm going to read to you a lengthy passage.
Okay.
This is several pages of the book, but I feel it's worth going over.
Okay.
Several years ago, a California psychiatrist pointed out that Batman stories are psychologically homosexual.
Is this because of Robin?
Our researchers confirmed this entirely.
Entirely? Okay.
Only someone ignorant of the fundamentals of psychiatry and the psychopathology of sex can fail to realize a subtle atmosphere of homoeroticism which pervades the adventures of the mature Batman and his young friend Robin. Male and female homoerotic overtones are also present in some science fiction, jungle, and other comic books. Just as ordinary crime comics contribute to the fixation of violent and hostile patterns by suggesting definite forms of their expression, so the Batman type of story helps to fixate homoerotic tendencies by suggesting the form of adolescent with adult or Ganymede Zeus type love relationship. Batman,
I can't wait. I cannot wait till this guy gets older. He watches like Back to the Future. Right.
And he would have. He totally would have, right?
And then and you just wait till like 300 rolls around.
He wouldn't have made it to that. Yeah. In the Batman type of comic book, such a relationship is depicted children before they can even read. Batman and Robin, the dynamic duo, also known as the Daring Duo, go into action in their special uniforms.
Oh my.
They constantly rescue each other from violent attacks by an unending number of enemies. The feeling is so conveyed that we men must stick together because there are so many villainous creatures who have to be exterminated. They lurk not only under every bed and also behind every star in the sky. Either Batman or his young boyfriend or both are captured. threatened with every imaginable weapon, almost blown to bits. It is.
They
boy
wrote
space
it in the book. They called him his young boyfriend.
Boy space friend. It is not boy friend.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Still.
Yeah. Still.
Almost blown to bits, almost crushed to death, almost annihilated. Sometimes Batman ends up in bed, injured, and young Robin is shown next to him. At home, they lead an idyllic life. They were Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson. Bruce Wayne is described as a socialite, and the official relationship is that Dick is Bruce Ward. They live in a sumptuous quarters with beautiful flowers and large vases and have a butler, Alfred. Batman is sometimes shown in a dressing gown.
Wait a second. I was like, okay, they live a lavish lifestyle. And then I noticed some of the words that were being chosen were like, these are homosexual words.
Sumptuous like quarters. Yeah.
Must be a woman. Like, what? Yeah, sumptuous stood out too. Like, what a word choice, man.
Batman is sometimes shown in a dressing gown. As they sit by the fireplace, the young boy sometimes worries about his partner. Something's wrong with Bruce. He hasn't been himself these past few days.
Oh my gosh.
It's like a wish dream of two homosexuals living together. Sometimes they're shown on a couch, Bruce reclining and Dick sitting next to him, jacket off, collar open, and his hand on his friend's arm.
Oh
like the girls in other stories, Robin is sometimes held captive by villains, and Batman has to give in or Robin gets killed.
Oh, man. But can you imagine the parent who's reading this book and doesn't know about Batman and is like, what the f*** am I letting my kids read?
Right. And like homophobia is like out of control at this point, right? Like this is not polite conversation. People do not talk about homosexuality. It is like not a
absolutely.
As far as the popular culture is concerned, they don't exist, right? Robin is a handsome ephemic boy, usually shown. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, this is like the same point in history when Turing was chemically castrated because he was homosexual.
Yes,
right. Like that. Yeah, this it's like illegal to be homosexual.
I think. Yes. Yeah.
It's just crazy.
Yes. So these are strong claims for sure. Robin is a handsome ephemic boy, usually shown in his uniform with bare legs. He is buoyant with energy and devoted to nothing on Earth or in interplanetary space as much as to Bruce Wayne. He often stands with his legs spread, the genital region discreetly evident.
Oh my gosh.
In these stories, there are practically no decent, attractive, successful women. A typical female character is the Catwoman, who is vicious and uses a whip. The atmosphere is homosexual and anti-feminine. If the girl is good-looking, she is undoubtedly the villainess. If she is after Bruce Wayne, she will have no chance against Dick. For instance, Bruce and Dick go out one evening in dinner clothes, dressed exactly alike. The attractive girl makes up to Bruce, while in successive pictures, young Dick looks on smiling, sure of Bruce. Violence is not lacking.
Sure, of Bruce. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. There's like all this language that are like they might as well just be saying erection over and over and over again. And then it's really unfortunate that his name is Dick because they're talking about him being a homosexual. And like, there's a woman, but he can't resist Dick. Like,
violence is not lacking in these stories. You are shown Batman and Robin standing in a room with a whole row of corpses on the floor. In a study of over 1,000 homosexual cases at the Quaker Emergency Service Readjustment Center, we found that the arousal of homosexual fantasies, the transition of fantasies into fact, and the transition from episodic homosexual experiences to a formed fixation of the pattern may be due to all sorts of accidental factors. The Batman type of story may stimulate children to homosexual fantasies, of the nature of which they may be unconscious. In adolescents who realize they may give added stimulation and reinforcement. In many adolescents, the homoerotic anti-feminist trend unconsciously aroused or fostered by these stories is demonstrable. We have inquired about Batman from overt homosexuals treated at the readjustment center to find out what they... Yeah, readjustment.
Whoa.
Yeah. To find out what they thought the influences of these Batman stories was on children and adolescents. A number of them knew these stories very well and spoke of them as their favorite reading. To reply of one of an intelligent, educated young homosexual was typical, quote, "I don't think they would do any harm sexually, but they probably would ruin their morals." One young sorry, go ahead.
No, there's just like this, like peeling back an onion, right?
Yeah.
Like the more you talk, the more I'm like having these realizations because it's like I live in the year 2025, right?
Yeah.
And so like going back 75 years,
yeah,
that a time I never lived. I've only read about. It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, it was illegal. Oh yeah, they believed it was a choice. Right. They believed that you could, through some sort of therapy or exposure therapy, whatever it is, like change how someone feels about something.
Right. And these are people like Wertham, as an example, and his colleagues believe that they're doing a service to these gay young men.
Yeah.
Right. And boys by asking them these questions.
Yeah.
And then publishing their answers in books. Right. And
oh man, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
HIPAA, huh? But it also makes me wonder, like, because there is some sort of bias in the data, as at least you're presenting it, of they just talked to these gay guys and they said these things.
Yeah.
Now, did they find some non-homosexuals and ask them the same questions and compare the answers?
Almost certainly not, right?
Because that's kind of the crazy part too, is because I'm also thinking about like kids that I know. That like I had a neighbor one time that like Allie and I, my wife and I, were her neighbor for a long time.
Yeah.
We have a young son that they got along. They did some like hung out with the kids together in the front yard and played and all that stuff.
Totally.
And there was this point where I don't remember exactly how it came up, but this little girl who was like 8 or something like that, not that young.
Yeah.
Made some comment like, "Oh, you guys are married. I thought you were brother and sister and you just live together all the time." It's like that is the level of innocence that most kids have. They can't 100%. Even conceptualize a thing like sex. Right? They can't they see this Batman and Robin behavior in like depicted in these books.
Yeah.
Cannot comprehend that they might be doing anything uncouth in the house because they're just buds.
Right.
Like that's part of the layer of this that's really crazy.
Yeah.
And pernicious, right?
And we have 32 episodes of this show where we read Golden Age comic book stories of Batman. And I defy you to find these overtones, right?
Oh yeah. They don't exist. Not a single time that I thought, oh, that was a weird way to draw that or anything. Like not once so far.
Yeah. Just a little bit more from this passage.
Oh yeah. Hit me. I can't wait.
One young homosexual during psychotherapy brought us a copy of Detective Comics with a Batman story. He pointed out a picture of, quote, the home of Bruce and Dick, a house beautifully landscaped, warmly lighted, and showing the devoted pair side by side, looking out a picture window. When he was 8, this boy had realized from fantasies about comic book pictures that he was aroused by men. At the age of 10 or 11, quote, I found my liking, my sexual desires in comic books. I think I put myself in the position of Robin. I did want to have relations with Batman. The only suggestion of homosexuality may be that they seem to be so close to each other. I remember the first time I came across the page mentioning, quote, the secret Batcave, end quote. The thought of Batman and Robin living together and possibly having sex relations came to my mind. You could almost connect yourself with the people. I was put in the position of the rescued rather than the rescuer. I felt I'd like to be loved by someone like Batman or Superman, end quote. A boy of 13 was treated by me in the clinic while he was on several years probation. He and a companion had forced a boy of 8, threatening him with a knife to undress and carry out sexual practices with them. Like many other homoerotically inclined children, he was a special devotee of Batman. Quote, sometimes I read them over and over again. They show off a lot. I don't remember Batman's name, but the boy's name is Robin. They live together. It could be that Batman did something with Robin like I did with the younger boy. Batman could have saved this boy's life. Robin looks something like a girl. He had only his trunks on.
Wow.
Yeah. So
sad.
100%, like Wertham is working with kids that are in really, really tough situations. And so insofar as these things are true, it's heavy stuff. I will say in 2012, Dr. Tilley, who I talked about before, put out a paper called Seducing the Innocent, Fredric Wertham, and the Falsifications That Helped Him Condemn Comics. Basically, the National Archive has had all of Fredric Wertham's research ever since he died. Just boxes and boxes and boxes of notes he took, letters that he wrote and received, and a lot of it actually organized as it was when he was working on this book. So you go to a box and it correlates to a chapter, right? In order.
Wow.
Right?
That's fascinating.
Yeah. In 2010, for the first time, the National Archives opened up Wertham's notes to researchers, right? And so Dr. Tilley was able to go back and look at these for the first time. And she wrote this paper. Quote, ultimately, I found that despite its accolades and its central role in moving comics further to the cultural sidelines, Wertham's seduction included numerous falsifications and distortions. This article documents specific examples of how Wertham manipulated, overstated, compromised, and fabricated evidence, especially that evidence he attributed to the personal clinical research with young people for rhetorical gain, end quote. So basically, she finds tons of way that he messed with the truth. He creates kids out of whole cloth.
So
right?
Full fabrication.
Yep.
Like
he
those
combines.
Those are his quotes.
Well, we're going to talk about the Batman ones specifically. She found the Batman ones. Yeah.
Oh boy.
He combines several kids into one person. He takes one kid and splits them up into many different people. He references kids that he never spoke to. So instead, he hears about them secondhand from his colleagues. He omits things that they say, rewrites things that they did say, and sometimes fabricates things that they did not say. So real kids will put words in their mouth, right?
Well, I was giving him credit when you were reading those quotes before. I thought, man, these are really disjointed, but I don't see ellipses anywhere. But no, yeah, he fully stitched those together. Wow.
Yeah. The Dr. Tilly's paper is about 30 pages, and 20 of it is just Tilly going over example after example after example of these falsifications. I encourage you to read it if you have the opportunity. But for this episode, we'll go over just the one. The kids who Wertham basically says Batman and Robin made them gay, right? Quote, Wertham shared the insights of a young homosexual man who stated, quote, I think I put myself in the position of Robin. I did want to have relations with Batman, end quote. The young man from the anecdote was actually two men, ages 16 and 17, who had been in sexual relationship with one another for several years and had realized they were homosexuals at the age of 10. Wortham combined their statements, failing to indicate that the 17-year-old is the one who noted, quote, the only suggestion of homosexuality may be that they seem to be close to one another, and omitting the phrase that followed, quote, like my friend and I, end quote. Further, Wortham did not make any mention of the two teens had found Submariner and Tarzan to be better subjects than Batman and Robin for their early erotic fantasies.
Oh, geez.
So,
but it's also kind of interesting because like the Batman Robin thing would not be the thing that stood out to me if I had a bias and I was looking for like the sexualization of the comics.
Sure,
I'd be looking at Catwoman who dresses in all leather and has a whip. Right?
Yeah,
and,
a deep plunge like V-neck, right? Like
yeah.
Guys
got blind spots, you could say.
It's interesting to think about the way that the culture shifts, right? Because the important thing that Tilly points out, right, is that these two men had been gay since they were 10.
Mm-hmm.
He's interviewing them at 17.
Mm-hmm.
And they're talking about, can you think about the trap that this is? You ask a gay person, did you find Batman attractive? Right? And they say, yeah, like,
of course.
They're two dudes. They're together. Like one's buff, right? Like, and Submariner and Tarzan, and like
a
I'm
bunch
gay.
of other men.
Yes, because I am attracted to men, right?
Yes.
Instead, he omits all that context that they've been gay for years, right? That what he asked them and the context of what he asked it to them. Instead, says like, I asked this young boy, you know, what they thought of comics, and they volunteered that Batman is sexy, right? The context is entirely different, right? It's like he's trying to make the case that the comics, the tail wagged the dog instead of the other way around, right? Yeah. Anyway, that's the sort of summation of what I have on Seduction of the Innocent. Is there anything else you want to know, or any thoughts you have on it before we move on?
I mean, did anything bad happen to this guy? Does like karma exist? Or
no. Actually, let me Google that. I don't think so.
You're gonna find out that he actually came out of the closet in this.
No, he made it all the way to 1981. He was 86 years old. He continued to practice psychology. He was super involved writing books. Like I said, he was cited in Brown v. Boards of Education, right? So he's part of the sort of like social conversation on an ongoing basis. This was aligned with the way a lot of people thought, right?
Yeah, it's just wild. I can't put my mind back into that kind of perspective. I don't think I'm capable of understanding. Yeah.
I will tell you, it's hard to push through and try to read that book, right? I spent the app I was using to read it, like tracks time. I spent like 14 hours.
Oh my
reading that book. Yeah,
that's crazy.
It's just page after page after page of like, I don't think that's true, or that framing is really suspect, or like that equivalence is false, right? Like, and you find yourself choking on it over and over and over again. It's like, well, what caused this person? Because it does come through in the pages that he cares, right? Yeah. And he doesn't seem crazy. What caused this person to feel this way and think this way? And like, it reads to me like he was kind of radicalized. Like, I don't think there's any better way to describe it of other than like he became so convinced of this one thing, and he kind of let it consume him, right? In the context of this book, right?
Yeah.
So he's the star witness in the subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency. It gets a ton of traction. It's all over the newspapers. It's all over everything. Congress ultimately decides not to act. There is no legislation that's done about comic books. However, like with most sort of like censorship bodies, even in modern history, right, the industry decides to regulate itself. So like the MPAA that gives movies like PG, PG-13R, right, they do that for themselves. The Recording Industry of America that puts the parental advisory on albums, they do that to themselves. They decide to form the Comics Code Authority.
So the parental advisory, I think that was a government thing. So
most of these follow this pattern,
okay,
where there's a moral panic, there's public hearings where the government says, hey, if you don't do something, we're going to regulate you. And then the industry regulates themselves.
And then I see. So what you're saying is these industries are saying like, no, don't regulate us.
Yes.
They're like, look, I'm already doing it. I'm doing it now. So you don't have to do anything. Okay.
There's a really interesting example from the early 90s in video games where like they had a congressional hearing and they showed like Night Trap. I don't know if you ever heard of that video game. And Mortal Kombat was a big one that they showed in Congress. It was televised, right, on C-SPAN and all that kind of stuff. And they said like these video games are awful and they're ruining kids, and that's why the SRB exists, right? Is the industry decided to self-regulate.
Got it. I didn't know that piece of the history. That's very interesting.
It's true of all of these. The Hays Code, it is a pattern that plays itself out over and over and over and over again. It is very frequent that a lot of types of regulation are avoided because Congress people we used to. This is less true now. But for decades and decades and decades, this was the pattern. You'd call the company in front of you and you'd say, you got to fix your shit. If you don't, we're going to regulate you. And then they would fix their shit. There's examples where that doesn't happen. Like the reason we have seatbelts in cars is because Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, and there was a bunch of hearings, and they said you need to fix it. They didn't, and now there's laws, right? Same is true for like the EPA. Like oil companies didn't decide that they were going to not spill oil. They kept doing that, right?
I'll just try not to.
Right? Lakes did just keep setting themselves on fire, right? So they made laws about those things. But in a lot of cases, industry regulates itself for good and for bad, right? Like I think the MPAA is probably a pretty good example where they say like they're giving parental guidance on it. And the Comics Code is a really bad example, right? They get a bunch of librarians and teachers to come up with this list of do's and don'ts.
It's a crazy list.
Yeah. Do you want to go over it?
Yes. Badly.
In the interest of time, that's where we're going to leave it today. Soon, we'll release the second half of this recording where Brian and I go over every rule in the Comics Code of 1954. It's got some stuff in there that will surprise you, and we had a lot of fun talking about it. After that, we go over some of the art and story from a comic Wertham name-checked the most, the infamous Crime Does Not Pay. I don't think you're going to want to miss it, so make sure to subscribe, and while you're down there, like and leave us a comment, and thanks for watching.